Hi, this is Jeff Allen. I'm giving a response to Jeff Roper on one of the questions that came up here on your Facebook post about you were talking about the different factors in history, kind of the reflection of violence in the name of religion and power was the title of the post. And he gave a lot of examples of the Manifest Destiny and German nationalism and the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow and segregation, and then American Christian nationalism, and and I mentioned a few others, and then things. And you said that sadly history is littered with multitudes of examples. Like equally disheartening is that we never seem to learn from our history, which is because we do not learn about history. I totally agree. And having grown up in the United States, I was one of those weirdos that loved history class. I remember taking history in the eighth grade, American history in eighth grade, and then I took the advanced placement history class in 11th grade, and was there were like two of us that were that really got the good history folks. I mean, I read every single. They gave us. I talked with the history teacher, my AP history teacher, 30 years later, and uh, and he said I was the only one of the only probably one or two people that actually read everything they gave us to read because we had 100 pages per night, 7 days a week for the entire year, and I actually did read it, and I loved it. It was American history, and uh, and we'd have quizzes every week. Like so, they would have quizzes, and we'd have. I was one. They'd pick two teams, and I was one of the team leaders often. And you pick the people that you want to be on their teams can help you kind of win the quiz, right? But two of us were really good, and a lot of people didn't care. They were like in the class just doing their baseball cards and stuff. But I mean, there were folks that liked it. I mean, there were a number of people that really liked it, but overall, there was a disinterest, and it wasn't just the history class. It was like I remember even the English composition class where you were studying literature. There was a disinterest among a number of people, but there were some that liked it. But and then I went on to college, um, to Multnomah, and there we had a history teacher, Dan Skalberg. He was great. He was just finishing his PhD in history and of French history. I think it's about the Quebec, and he was really inspiring. I think I took like 6 or 7 history classes from him. If Multnomah had offered a history major at the time, I probably would have gotten a history major and double major, right? But and it went on, and then I moved to France, and it was like night and day. I finally realized now being here for most of the past 35 years, where I mean I can go down. We travel a lot and stuff, and and to see go to museums and go to cathedrals and go to monuments. They're all over the place. They're all over. I mean, and French people know their history because it's been the whole education system just drives it into them, right? And I've been realizing over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, how little history Americans know about their own history, uh, because there's so little of it. and I and I don't think it's because there's such it's a shallow level of content of like 300 years. 300 years is a drop in a bucket, right? Compared to European or Middle Eastern history, which goes back. We have documentation. Well, documentation. Documentation in that's been inscribed in rocks, right? That goes back thousands of years. Um, I mean, look at the Rosetta Stone, right? Which helped us figure out a number of things about language. The, I'm just amazed by. I keep thinking why Americans don't like history, and I think about the. This is going to be a video in one of my chapters on understanding Americans and working with Americans, understanding working with Americans in my video series about the YouTube. Compared to I'm doing one working the French and working the Germans. I've got a number of different video series on this, and one I think one of the reasons why the history is lacking. Not only because of Isaac Asimov's quote on ignorance in 1980 about the Americans in general about not reading, which I think contributes a lot because a lot of Americans don't read after they finish college. When they do finish college, right, or high school. Whereas French people read. I mean, they read a lot. Now it's going down. I see people more on the phones now, but in the subway and the metro and the tram and all that. But a lot of people do read on the trains. I've been amazed looking every couple of years. I look at just around me and see how many people are reading something, right? And newspapers, books, and stuff. And it's become more phones because there are more people on the trains and all that. But people do read, and the book market, the book market is a big thing, and it's highly encouraged. It's part of the cultural aspects of the French culture. But I think about why do Americans not interested in history? Why do they want to learn about history and know about history so you don't make the same mistakes over and over again? And I think one of the reasons, one of the factors comes to mind is that the immigration, the wave of immigration that happened with the colonies to start with, then the successive waves with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, there were certain periods of time when there were immigration from different places, right? And immigration, the first few waves came from Europe mainly. Uh, then there was a certain wave that came from Asia later on, and I'd say the 1900s, because you got a lot that came off to the Caribbean islands as well at the time. And those waves, I think, because of the reason for the immigration was a lot of it came from exile, some type of exile, some wanting to get away from their home country. Uh, that's often a reason, even whatever. But the current waves of immigration. I mean, we that means we do still have people that want to leave their countries and come to the United States or Canada. You see this a lot. Canada is very open on immigration right now, currently, and I've seen people that move from Europe currently to North America, where it's a different wave because it's more for they want to learn English, right? So there's an opportunity there. It's not so much because they have to want to get away from so much a negative or hostile environment. But at the time of the colonies through the Industrial Revolution, for the Europeans coming to the United States at the time, the there was a desire. We can see now. We can see this from the history of the people not knowing their language of their parents, right? Because the parents wanted them to focus on knowing that. And the parents probably didn't transfer much knowledge or as much things about their history from their home countries. Where we do see that in the colonies, because we can see from the colonies, especially with the Pilgrims, especially with the earlier colonies of like the Amish and Quakers. There's a retention of history, a retention of identity. But we can see in a large number that there was a kind of denying that identity, giving it up, and wanting the children to only know English and become part of the new community, right? Which is very mixed. It's a melting pot, which caused this loss of identity. Now you can see in Pittsburgh. I've lived in a number of places in the states. You can see in New York City. In some places in New York City, you have these like little. You do have these little like neighborhoods, right? So Chinatown, Little Italy, right? And that's really interesting. But you see in Pittsburgh, the where we lived for a while, there were certain neighborhoods as well, and that retains some identity. Uh, but I think what happened was the melting pot thing turned into a mixture where there was a loss, and I've got cousins that had like the cousin the in-laws of cousins who wanted, and when they could become my age or retired, they want to kind of learn about the history of their parents and their grandparents from Hungary and stuff. And there's this returning to the source, returning to the thing which they had lacked for 60 years, basically. And I think that this is this permeates the culture, especially American culture. I think in Canada it's slightly different because we visited Canada for 3 weeks this past summer, and it was really interesting to attend a lot of museums. We went to quite a few museums. We went to 3 different guided tours per big town, 2 or 3, on boats, walking, and buses, and pretty much all the stories converged in all the big cities about the history of Canada, with the French speaking part and the English speaking part, and the history of all that, and the indigenous peoples and the First Nations. There was a lot of it all converged. So there was the same story in general. And we lack in this complete in the States. I mean, there's very little knowledge other than the Cub Scouts recounting the Thanksgiving story, which I remember doing as a child. But I see in my own children who have been raised in France, they know much more about the history of France because of the educational system, and how it's you still learn history even in college. I mean, you have the history, geography, history, and French language are the 3 most core topics all the way through high school years, every single year, and even in college, even if you're doing math and science, you still do geography and history. It's part of the thing, right? And despite the major you're working on, and because it's so important, the history, and I think it's because maybe of the inland countries in Europe, the large inland countries, or even the smaller ones too, on the portuary countries, that the history is so important. Well, there were a lot of wars, right? So I think probably another factor too is that. So I'm kind of I'm brainstorming as I'm going here. I don't have a plan of what I want to talk about. I had a couple points, but this is growing as I go. Um, that the fact that there were a lot of wars in Europe, actually in the Middle East as well, wars generate history, right? They generate animosity and alliances, right? So now, if I can, speak mainly from European history, know that given that I know that the best, having lived here for so long and having studied it before, and having lived in it for so long, and visited a lot of these museums and things that I studied about when I was in college, in high school and college in the States, that these wars have created the history of the wars created these alliances in the enemies and everything, which created, the thing between the countries. And people know this. It's part of the culture. It's part of history. All these monuments around you. There's a Catholic church in every single town, right? With its own history. And and I think that reliance and importance of the history of the people and all that, and because there were scars made by the wars happened, but I think that the lack. I mean, I asked my sisters when I'm in the military at one point in time. I said, when was the last war on American soil? She said 9/11. I kind of laughed because and people have a big debate what a war is, right? But I think the lack of war on the territory, which war is not always a good thing. People want to not have wars, but there will always be wars because everyone has armies and everyone has a reason to defend and to mainly to defend their own, defend their own country. I mean, that's every single country has a. I don't know any country that doesn't have at least some kind of standing army. And the fact that there are wars causes identity and the wanting to maintain that identity because of the risk of being conquered. Uh, uh, and there's also the desire to conquer, right? So, and we can see that in some countries. We look at the angle and look at the Anglophone history. Anglophone history is a history of conquering, right? England, the British Empire, and now American, the kind of the military enterprise, which is part of policing. It didn't happen early, but the policing happened. The international policing happened, yeah, after for World War One, mainly World War Two, and moving on. And I think that is everything happens elsewhere, right? It doesn't happen on American soil. And I think that because that happens by the people leaving, except for Vietnam, everyone came back, and there were a lot of post-trauma syndrome and all that. That there is the American people haven't lived through the things that want them to keep their identity in that way, right? Not the risk of losing their identity and being overcome and overthrown. And I think these are things to think about. Why there's a lack of interest, or why there's a lack of interest. These are some factors. I'm sure there are way more, and I'm thinking of this as I go. Right, I'm brainstorming of this. I've never actually taken the time to sit down and think about really why Americans don't know their history. And this is the first kind of attempt to do that. Just sitting down for the fast 15 minutes. So that's something interesting to consider, and to look at other countries that continually go through war. And I'm not going to mention them here now because there's plenty. But there is the desire to maintain that identity where they're at in their countries, and also maintain it when they go somewhere with the current waves of immigration, right? So, those are my thoughts, and thanks for taking time to listen to this.